Hi friends, welcome back to the studio. I'm super excited because I'm launching a new series on this channel called Pottery at Home. This is a special series that I created to answer some of your most asked questions that will give you everything that you need to know about starting your pottery journey at home. In this video, I will cover why you should rent a kiln instead of buying and how you can go about doing that. So let's get into it. Okay, first let's talk about why you should rent a kiln, and then later on I'm going to get to how to and some important information that you need for doing that. But the very first reason that you should rent a kiln is obviously money. Kilns are so expensive. It's outrageous how expensive they are, honestly. Especially if you're just beginning. I mean, if you're not 100% sure that you're going to commit to this craft for a long time, renting a kiln is really the way to go. In case you're wondering how much kilns cost in my country, you could definitely get a used one for less than $1,000. I mean, maybe you can find a used one for less than $1,000 if you're lucky. My current one I bought used for 1,200 euro, but I'm pretty sure the new one of this brand is like 2,500, something like that. So yeah, they're pretty expensive. I mean, no matter what country you're coming from, they're expensive. So yeah, that's definitely why you should rent one. You should also rent a kiln because kilns need to be filled to fire their best. It's all about the atmosphere that kilns create inside of them. So where there's heat pockets, you need airflow throughout the kiln. Kiln should be evenly packed. So ideally, you have a very full kiln to operate most efficiently. It's also going to save you a lot of money per pot on your electrical bill. So unless you're making a lot of pottery, it's going to take you a long time to fill that kiln to the point that it's full enough to make it reasonable to run it. I mean, most potters don't fire more than, say, once a month. Some potters fire only once every 6 months. So it just makes sense to stick a few pots into a kiln that is not currently running. Along those same lines, if you are filling the kiln faster, you're going to get results faster. And this is extremely important for things like testing. So when you're trying out a new glaze, you want to do a few tests before you apply it to a whole kiln's worth of pieces. But how are you supposed to test that if you need to fill that kiln? So if you're sharing a kiln with someone else, you're going to get that turnover faster and you're going to be able to learn faster and yeah, have less failures, I guess. Okay, if that hasn't convinced you yet, let me tell you about the last reason why I think you should rent a kiln instead of buying, and that is because kilns are a community resource. Okay, so I'm firmly of the belief that pottery itself is best performed in a community setting, so amongst a group of people. There's so many benefits to working in a community setting, like I could go on, but a few of them are you learn from each other, like someone's testing out a new clay, someone's testing out a new glaze. Oh, why did this go wrong? Well, someone's gonna give you some great feedback on that. This is an invaluable resource to have people around you like that. Pretty much there's always going to be someone who can teach you something there. Another reason is that we have these big pieces of equipment, you know, kiln obviously, but wheels, extruders, tables, chairs, you know, all sorts of like the equipment around pottery can get really expensive, and not to mention like rent if you're living in a city. It really makes sense to share these resources because no one's going to be in the pottery all the time. Things like managing the supplies, having clay get delivered. I mean, that is a huge thing. Clay is heavy, we gotta move it. It really helps to have a community around you to do that. So although I'm working in my own studio at this time, I mean, this is the first time ever that I've had my own studio, and it's nice in certain ways for sure, but ultimately I would love to get back to a community setting just for all of those reasons, and it's just nice to be around people sometimes. Okay, I'm sure I've convinced you by now why it makes sense to rent a kiln. Probably you weren't even wondering because the price point is already such a barrier to entry. I get that. So let's talk about how you can rent a kiln now. Firstly, who to ask. So probably the best place to ask is one of these community studios that I was talking about because they probably already have a system set up for this. So the studio that I founded in Berlin, it had a system called the take-home clay. You would buy the clay. The clay, you know, we knew worked with our kiln temperatures and with our glazes, and we had a whole system set up. We made that really, really easy for them, and I think that most studios will have at least a system set up for that if they have the kiln capacity to offer that service. So definitely check out a community clay studio if you have one in your area. Probably the second best place to ask is a local potter. And honestly, probably anywhere in the world that you live, there's going to be a local potter, because there is a tradition of pottery in pretty much every culture in the world. I think I'm gonna go ahead and say every culture in the world has a tradition of pottery. And that means no matter where you are in the world, there's going to be someone in your area practicing that craft. So just go on the Google and type in your area, type in a pottery or firing service or something like that, and see what pops up. Another amazing resource that is fairly new, but I wish more people will know about it, is Kilnshare. So Kilnshare, I think it's kilnshare.com. It's a website where potters can list their kilns, give like the information, like the dimensions and things I'm going to talk about later. And then anyone can have access to that information. They can see where you're in the world you're located, and then they can contact you. So this is really amazing resource. I've been in contact with the founder as well. This is not sponsored or anything. I just think it's awesome. It's all free. It's amazing. And I've actually been linking this website at the bottom of every one of my videos because this is a question I get asked all the time. I just think it's an awesome resource. So if you're not sure that there's any potters in your area, you can check that. Otherwise, just go on the Google. Or, you know, if you know of a potter who works down the street, just go knock on their door. That's definitely a great place that you can go and ask for firing services. Okay, and then the last few places I would ask, I'm just gonna group them all together, are schools. So grade schools, high schools, even universities, and then also community centers. So things like recreational centers, senior homes, any place where people kind of get together and do activities. And then even schools will usually have a kiln because, well, if they have art class and they do things with clay, they usually have a kiln for that. So you can definitely reach out to those places. Some of these may require you to take a class beforehand, or sometimes maybe it's a good idea to take a class beforehand so you can kind of get to know the teacher, get to know the setup, know the firing temperatures and things like that. Okay, other things that you should know about renting a kiln and firing. So this is really basic, but I wanted this series to be for like absolute beginners who have never done this before and don't know anything about firing temperatures and whatever. So if that's you, definitely listen to these next few points because some of these are not necessarily intuitive, but are going to save you a lot of heartbreak down the line. The biggest, most important thing you need to consider when you are using someone else's kiln is firing temperatures. So if you don't know, clay fires at all sorts of different temperatures. So we have on one end low fire earthenware, which fires at very low temperature. We have stoneware, we have porcelain, we have bone china. So we have all of these different types of clays. And of course, within stoneware, we have low fire, mid-range, high fire stoneware. I mean, there's so many different types of clay, and they all have different firing temperatures and different optimal firing temperatures as well. So when you buy your clay, there should be some temperatures listed on the package. Now, I don't know about every single clay that's being sold, but the clay that I buy has two different temperature ranges. So one is the range that it is okay to fire our pottery in. So there's a low temperature and a high temperature. So I believe on my clay, the low temperature is 1220 Celsius and the high temperature is 1260. It should be fired somewhere within that range in order for it to be like actual functioning ceramic. And then in addition to that, there's what's called a vitrification point. And so what this is the point that your clay becomes more or less waterproof. Waterproof is actually like, there's a whole range of what that means. We're not gonna get into that. What you need to know is that there is a certain temperature that the particles in your clay will melt together, create that barrier, and it will become waterproof. So ideally, if you're making pottery, like things that are going to be used, they should be waterproof. So you need to be firing past that point. So my firing range is 1220 to 1260. My vitrification temperature, however, is 1230. So I'm going to be firing at 1240 to make sure that it is past that vitrification temperature. You know what I mean? So I explain all that to say that you need to know your clay. So like get the information on the clay and then give that information to the potter who's going to be firing your works. So ideally, your clay has the same vitrification and firing temperature as the potter. And even more ideally, you're going to use the same clay as the potter who's firing your work. there's additional benefits to that, such as that this clay has already been vetted by an experienced potter, so they know that it's good clay. In case anything goes wrong in the firing process, they're going to know, oh, this clay doesn't like this and that, or in the building process, oh, this clay is a little short, you should use it rather in this way. So especially if you're a beginner, that type of information is invaluable. So it definitely helps to know someone who knows that clay. And a third reason is that this potter has probably looked at all of the clays that are available in that area, and they're choosing that clay for a reason. So maybe it's local, maybe it's more cheap than other clays, maybe it's from a great supplier that they have a relationship with. Maybe you can buy the clay directly from that potter instead of having to go out and do the research and get a delivery yourself. You guys could go in together, get a clay delivery, and it's going to be cheaper for everyone. Hashtag community ceramics. So yeah, that's definitely what I recommend. Obviously, if the potter is using red clay and you want to work with porcelain, it's not going to work. But if you don't care and it's similar enough clay, then just go for it. So another thing that's important when you are renting a kiln is to know the kiln dimensions. I mean, this is really only important if you're going to be making larger work. If you're going to be making mugs, typically mugs will fit in any kiln, but especially if you're working with a hobby potter to fire your pots, some people have pretty small kilns. So if you've been watching this channel for a little while, you know that I went from a 140 liter kiln into a little baby 60 liter kiln that's only 40 centimeters wide and I think 35 centimeters tall. It's pretty small, and I keep having to make my pottery in pieces so that they'll fit into the kiln. Yeah, so this is really only important if you are making large scale work, like if you're a sculptor or maybe you want to make a big platter or something. Definitely check with the person who owns the kiln, the dimensions, to make sure that your pots fit in the kiln, because everything needs to fit in the kiln. There's no way around that. Okay, a couple other limitations that you might not consider if you're a beginner. One thing is that the thickness of the clay is really important to keep an eye on. You don't want to be working with too thick of clay because that's going to cause problems. Probably your pot is going to crack or break. So I always tell people pretty much the max is 2 centimeters. You don't want to make your walls very thick. If you're making a big sculpture, you have to make it hollow. Like, you can't have that thing solid. It's just gonna cause heartbreak. It's not gonna work in the kiln. Things happen in the kilns, cracks happen, and one way to greatly mitigate that from happening is to make your pottery not too thick. I have a whole video about cracks and I'll link it up here. But the reason I mentioned that in this video is because if you have a solid chunk of clay, or even if your walls are just too thick, the potter might refuse to even fire your work because they know that it's going to explode and it could potentially damage the kiln. So keep that in mind if you're going to be renting a kiln. Another one is you definitely don't want to be adding things into your clay. So whether that's a wire armature or some newspaper, or I don't know, what do people add? Beads, things like that. You definitely don't want to be adding anything into your clay because more likely than not, the potter in charge is going to refuse to fire your work. You might see people online who are like working with modeling clay and they've got an armature inside and they've got some newspaper to bulk out a section, some tin foil. That doesn't work for studio ceramics. That doesn't work if you're going to be firing your work. They're using a different type of clay that is probably air dry clay, I guess. That's not going to work for firing it. So don't add anything into your clay unless the potter who's firing your work specifically says that it's okay. Another limitation that probably you know already, but I just want to throw it in here in case you don't, is that the bottoms of your work is probably not going to get glazed. So most pottery just like has the bottom, just the bottom is unglazed and the rest of it is glazed. That's totally fine for pots and stuff. But if you're making things like sculpture or like beads is pretty common. So like if you're making jewelry or even like spoons, anything that's going to be touching the kiln shelf is going to be unglazed. And this is because in the kiln, the glaze liquefies and it's going to stick to anything that it comes in contact with. So it needs to be the bare clay on the kiln shelf. There's different ways around this. Like there's different supports that you can get, like for the kiln that will string beads along a wire, for example. So there's ways around it, but not all potters have this type of equipment. So if you're really interested in making beads or spoons or something that will require that, definitely talk to the potter, because maybe they have something for you, or they can recommend you to buy something. They're usually not that expensive to buy, like a little wire for your beads to go on. So that's definitely an option that you can just purchase it yourself. Okay. Next important point is glazing. So when you do not have your own studio where you are producing your pottery and firing it in the same location, glazing suddenly becomes an issue. So it's difficult to transport pottery in general. Even finished pottery, we have to be careful when we're shipping it. But when you're transporting your bone dry pots to the kiln to be fired for the first time, that's difficult. What is basically impossible is transporting a freshly glazed piece to the kiln without screwing up the glaze if you're using dipping glazes. So there's two main types of commercial glazes that you will have available to you typically. So one comes as a powder, but you mix it with water and then it becomes a dipping or pouring glaze. This type of glaze is not very sticky. Like, it's gonna coat the surface of your pot, but if you rub it with something, it's gonna come off. So this is not ideal for like wrapping it in newspaper, putting it in a box and transporting to the studio. What you should rather use is a paint-on glaze. So paint-on glazes, they have additional ingredients in them that make them way more sticky, make them more viscous so they can be spread easier with a paintbrush. You're not really going to be able to paint very well with a dipping glaze. So with these paint-on glazes, basically it's like actual paint, so it dries out on the surface and then it will not fall off even if you wrap it in newspaper. So if you're going to be glazing at home, I definitely recommend you get the paint-on glazes, and then you should have no problem transporting them. Another option that I should mention is that some potters are very friendly and they will let you store your glazes in the studio. So what you can do is, after the potter fires your pot for the first time after the bisque, you can go visit the studio, do your glazing, and then the potter can do the final fire. So you don't have to pick up, bring home, bring back, you know what I mean? Okay, and then the final thing that I want to talk about today is to curb your expectations. So if you've been practicing pottery for any length of time, you know that it's hard. And you know that when you buy a glaze from the store and you see the little swatch and it's just so beautiful and perfect and that's exactly what we want, it doesn't look like that when it's on your pot. Not only because it's on a different surface, it's on a different clay, it's probably being fired to a different firing temperature or a different firing schedule. It's being fired in a different kiln, it's being mixed with a different type of water. There's all these crazy, like, endless amount of things that can go wrong when you're taking a commercial glaze and putting it on your pot. So you want to test, right? And this is not just when it comes to glazes, it really coming to anything. So clays are all different, you know, it might be a different color than you expected, you know, it's more tan than bluey cream, right? Or the handle doesn't like to be connected to a pot in a certain way and it cracks. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. So I just want you to know that, so you come in with an attitude of exploration, of experimentation. I'm just telling you this because I want you to not get discouraged, because it's totally normal. This is another amazing reason that you should rent a kiln, is because the person there, as you're picking them up, you can say, I expected it to look a little bit like this, and then maybe that potter has time to have a conversation with you about what could have gone wrong and how to change that for the future. So pottery is an amazing craft, and you're going to be potting for your whole dang life. So don't rush it, and be humble and get excited, get curious, and go get muddy. Bye, friends.